Madcap, how did we end up here? How did we end up here? How am I talking about a Paul Feig movie with you on my YouTube channel? I haven't made a video in what, 3 weeks? Haven't done a live stream, haven't done anything 3 weeks. And it's like, hey, I'm talking about Bridesmaids. That's my favorite movie of all time. Absolutely fantastic. This was a suggestion from you, which as time has passed the last few days, it's really grown on me. Just to let people know who are listening, I'm like a few beers in, so I'm in a right mindset for this. This is revisiting Bridesmaids.
Please rewind this cassette.
So let's preface this, right? So the first thing that really launched my YouTube channel years ago was talking about the Ghostbusters reboot when that was really popular, and in particular talking about Paul Feig and what happened to him, that I was a fan of his work. I liked him in Heavyweights. I liked his work on The Office. I liked Freaks and Geeks. And then he made Bridesmaids, which I did not like. He made Spy, which I did like. And then eventually he made The Heat, which I did not like. And then he made Ghostbusters. So the thing with the revisiting series is we go back and look at movies that were culturally significant over the last decade. And we try to see if they still have merit or they hold up. And this is definitely, I think, unquestionably, without me saying it with any hesitation, one of the most overrated films of the last decade. By far. This film made $288 million. It was critically acclaimed. It was nominated for 2 Academy Awards, Best Supporting Actress and Best Screenplay. It made Kristen Wiig a movie star. It's the most successful Judd Apatow produced film of all time. My favorite podcast recently, The Rewatchables, did a whole episode about this movie where the hosts were praising it. So people still talk about this movie in a positive light. So the question about whether it holds up or not, I think, is almost pointless because I didn't like this movie when it came out, and I thought it was terrible. So let me start with you, Madcap. Do you remember when you first saw this movie? Did you see it when it came out, or did you catch this later? What's your relationship with Bridesmaids?
I didn't see it when it came out, but after it did, we caught a rental of Bridesmaids at Blockbuster, and just growing up on Judd Apatow comedies, including like the Seth Rogen, Evan Goldberg run, I initially found it pretty decent. I mean, I didn't like it as much as like For Your Virgin or Pineapple Express, but I think as time has gone on, I lean towards more to Superbad for many reasons. But at the time, I found it decent, and you kind of miss out on one other movie that Paul Feig directed. There was The Heat 2 years after Bridesmaids. I didn't really like it that much, but I did really enjoy Spy. But the less we say about Ghostbusters, the better, because I think enough's been said. It's a huge disaster.
Well, that's
Um,
that's the that's the difference, right? This film was successful, and I think in some ways I think it's as not only as bad, I think it's a worse movie than Ghostbusters just for the fact that people pretend that this movie's really good and that it was so successful. Like, I'm confused about this movie's popularity. I don't mind if the movie did well, but this is like considered a classic.
oh well, it has to be.
I also agree with you on Superbad, like being the Judd Apatow movie that's aged the best. Because I even think like 40-Year-Old Virgin and Knocked Up and that stuff, they've aged a little bit.
Yeah, yeah. They have, but I think with as we go further into this movie, yeah, I look more towards Superbad because just unlike this movie, it's a much tighter movie. It's well directed. I mean, Greg Mottola was a good choice to helm the movie, and the script by Rogan and Goldberg. I mean, that was like their American Werewolf in London. They wrote that script in high school, but not sure how much of it's changed since they first wrote it. But look at the final product now. I mean, it's a terrific movie.
Yeah, and Rogan and Goldberg are still doing good work. Like they're Invincible and The
Fuck yeah.
Boys. They're still producing or working on good stuff. Where I feel like Kristen Wiig's borderline become like a has been,
Oh, big time.
and Paul Feig has become a has been. Melissa McCarthy isn't the superstar she was for like what 5 years, 6 years. Kate McKinnon has not become a thing, despite Hollywood still trying to make her a thing outside. Also, if we're talking overrated, Kate McKinnon on SNL and just in general is like extremely overrated.
Hmm.
But that's talking more about like Ghostbusters. But so I don't even know how to jump into this because it's weird. This is actually a super long movie. It has a lot of scenes. There's so much to unpack here. I know you have some notes. I would just start off with why I think, because the mystery to me, this is really what I want to start with, is why people, because there's going to be that argument, comedy is subjective, right? We're going to hear that from people who like this movie, although I don't think we're going to get a lot of Bridesmaids fans attacking us. So whatever, comedy is subjective. Okay, if stuff in this movie is funny to you, I'm not going to argue that point. However, the merits of this as a movie, I think, can very much be argued. It's not well directed. It's horribly edited.
Oh, agree.
Arguably, it's got some decent acting from some of the supporting cast. It's not, it's not like John Hamm is like terrible in this movie, or even Melissa McCarthy, to be fair, isn't like terrible in this movie. I don't like her character, but she isn't like giving a bad performance. I think there's some nice production design, costume design. I don't think the movie has a bad look necessarily, but I've always been baffled because this was my experience with it. Because with this revisit series, we go through the history of these things. So I went to a drive-in to go see a double feature of Cowboys and Aliens and Bridesmaids. What the fuck? So Cowboys and Aliens, huge disappointment. Like, really good first 30 minutes, and I was like, what happened to Favreau? And this is after Iron Man 2. It was like, oh my god, is Favreau a hack? And then it got super cold because this was in Pennsylvania. And I started to watch like the first 15, 20 minutes of Bridesmaids, but it got so cold that we left because we were like freezing because Pennsylvania gets very, very cold at night. So I didn't actually watch
Yeah.
the whole movie till like later. So I rented this and X-Men First Class. Now, I'd seen X-Men First Class in the theater, but we rented both of these movies, and I was like, yeah, everyone says Bridesmaids is great. And I remember just sitting there being, like, baffled at how terrible this movie was. And just being like, what the fuck? This is like a 93% on Rotten Tomatoes. It got nominated for Best Screenplay. Everybody loved this movie. It's. So let's start with this thing. So like Kristen Wiig coming off SNL as a sketch comedian. I feel like her getting nominated for this is almost like when Sacha Baron Cohen gets nominated for a Borat movie, where I feel like, how does he get nominated for a screenplay for a movie where he's clearly like improvising and staging sequences? I don't feel like this movie was written. And I'm very confused about that. I feel like that was like all the comedies that weren't nominated for Oscars, including the Judd Apatow ones, or something like The Hangover even, and then they pick this movie to be the one that they nominate, feels like that only happened because it was women. And I know that's a
It seems
cynical
that way.
take, but I can't, like Superbad, Knocked Up. Knocked Up was critically acclaimed. It was this huge movie. Those movies don't get Oscar nominations, but Bridesmaids is the one. Like Melissa McCarthy's the person who gets the acting nomination out of all the comedic actors of the last decade.
Yeah, well, that didn't really hold up to good light as years came.
Well, my problem with this movie is it's like a lot of things. It's a series of sketches with improv. So
Yeah.
generally the movie is, and just an incredibly unlikable, quite frankly, a bitch of a lead character, which
Hmm.
people would say, oh well, she was going through struggles of life, right? She like owns a bakery. She's getting fucked by John Hamm.
Well,
Um,
I mean, she's fucking him, so
Yeah. It's just like the idea is like her life's falling apart and it's Kristen Wiig, like it's like her baby, and this is really a big moment for Paul Feig, where he'd been working with Judd Apatow for years, and then he finally gets to direct a movie like this, and it makes him like a big name for a few years, and he makes a few he makes like 3 hits in a row. I feel like it was the sketch format of her transferring over to that to a movie where, I mean, I don't even know how to jump into it. The worst thing about this movie is there's these scenes where they're clearly improvising and she's improvising and they go on for like 6 minutes
Mhm.
and they're unbearable. It's not cringy in the way that like The Office is with Michael Scott where it's funny. It's like just uncomfortable and annoying and grating. There's the scene where they're like trying to have the battle of who's going to give the better speech that just keeps going.
Yeah, they're, like, constantly one-upping each other. It's just like, yeah, I mean, yeah, it's like you said, it's just like most of this movie is like a series of, like, sketches. There's no fucking relationship to the story. There's no sense of pacing, and that was shocking when I first watched this. And because this was on Peacock, and so I was kind of very trepidatious about revisiting this movie, but the opportunity was open. Bridesmaids is on Peacock. I could watch it for free for fuck have you. But yeah, I saw it, and yeah, first time watching it because I watched this movie twice to get my shit together, to get my notes ready for this conversation, and yeah, I'm just baffled by how uneventful this movie feels, even though there's like stuff happening to make the audiences cackle. But it's like the Seth MacFarlane syndrome, where same shit that happened with Seth MacFarlane is that he blew up when Ted was like a huge box office hit, and then he makes stuff like A Million Ways to Die in the West and Ted 2. And they all suffer the same issue that most modern comedies suffer from, especially with the Paul Feig Apatow syndrome. It's just like, like a gag scene happens and it just hard cuts to something else. And there's no value coming out of the prior scene other than you're supposed to laugh at it. So it's just like scene, scene, scene. There's no like real momentum, or it's not building up to anything. It's just like, here's Kristen Wiig and Rose Byrne trying to one up each other with the fucking speeches, and here's like a moment at a fitting where they all get food poisoning, and it just like it doesn't really like stop at some point, or you're expecting like another payoff out of that, but again, it's just like that's toilet humor, and that's pretty much what people consider the funniest scene out of that movie.
Well, jokes aren't set up for like payoffs. It's just like these random moments that happen
Mhm.
that are supposed to. And here's the thing: I think Kristen Wiig is very talented. I actually think she's a very good actress.
I think she's good in like dramatic roles.
Yes, I agree. I think she was good on Saturday Night Live. This movie, on the other hand, it's she's so unlikable. It's really like my big thing is that the lead character, and I'm not saying you can't have an unlikable lead that's funny. That totally works in a comedy, but and people are gonna say I'm just saying this because she's a woman, but it's all of the issues in the movie, all the things that happen, and all of the things that like she does or that the comedy comes from her being such a shitty person that
Mhm.
you don't find it funny. You're more just like, well, why would anyone be friends with her? Why is she so cringy? It's not like she's cringy yet there's still something charming or compelling about it. It's just very uncomfortable and very unfunny. Like it's desperate is what I would say. It's like a desperate attempt to try and get people to laugh. And maybe if you cut some of these scenes down from like 6 minutes to like 2 minutes and it was like a 90 to 100-minute long movie, I think some of this stuff would work better. This movie's like what, like 2 hours and 6 minutes or something?
Yeah, it's just 2 hours.
Yeah, it's long as I mean, this was an issue with like all the Apatow movies for the most part. I feel like Forgetting Sarah Marshall and like Superbad didn't suffer from this as much, but it's an issue with all of his movies where they do all this improvisation and then they don't like cut the movie down. They like he makes these 2 hour plus movies. Except Apatow kind of gets away with it because I feel like he has more talented improvisers and the bits
Yeah.
do work. Where Paul Feig doing it, I feel like Apatow probably does kind of like have some bit of control on his set and like focus his actors, and he knows what he's looking for. And it feels like with Paul Feig, I feel like he doesn't direct his movies.
Yeah, yeah, I definitely agree on that. Is just well, the thing is that he should, because he is the fucking director of his own movies. So I feel like with more oversight, especially in editing, he could at least. It's the same issue I have with Ghostbusters. I mean, he could at least cut the fat down, but I he just has too much fun watching these scenes as he's like running dailies while like getting this film together. It's just like he has too much fun to the point where he doesn't know how to let go of some scenes. I know most of the film was held by Kristen Wiig's part, since she is like the co-writer along with or other collaborating sketch writer who she's worked across SNL with Kristen Wiig, but yeah, it's he just doesn't really know how to like know when the scene ends or knows the importance of like pacing and establishing scenes that could, follow up to something else, and
Well, he's
it's
also
weird.
just a really like flat director, and it's weird because Freaks and Geeks, which Jake Kasdan directed a lot of that, but Paul Feig like worked on it so much. I figured, like, I was a Paul Feig fan when this movie came out, and I was like, well, shit, Paul Feig's great. This is going to be really good, and it's like he doesn't know how to set up a scene creatively. Visually, he has no style, which Judd Apatow doesn't either, by the way.
No, he doesn't.
This falls more into like I would compare this to like Trainwreck or like
Yeah, the whole line of like, it's that weird thing that both Apatow and Feig, got their asses crossed about. It's just like they want to promote comedies for women, and they think like there's not enough comedies that have leading women in them. But when you look back at Howard Hawks movies, even if they're not like leading roles, they do. There are female characters in those movies that work in the context of what their characters are given to do, and they actually come out pretty. Because I think one of your favorite films, I think it's My Lady Eve or
All About Eve, yeah.
All About Eve, yeah, and you mentioned how timeless it feels, even though it was a movie made from like the 50s. And I think there's like a lot of examples of that, like His Girl Friday by Howard Hawks, and
Yeah,
the Woody
Bringing
Allen
Up
film,
Baby is a very funny movie.
hmm or like Woody Allen movies, like
Woody Allen's a perfect example. I actually think that's an even better example than Hawks of like well-written female characters in comedies that are relatable.
mhm. And they weren't always reliant on crass humor, toilet humor, or just sophomoric humor. I mean, when you look at Woody Allen, and I know he's like a controversial thing to bring up nowadays, but when you look at stuff like Annie Hall, Manhattan, there's just like a level of sophistication to them that they don't really dumb down like the nature, or they don't really just like pander to the audience with shitty jokes. I mean, Woody Allen's like a terrific writer, like has he always been back in the 70s during his height, and he's had like pretty interesting characters played by these wonderful actresses. Like you had Diane Keaton, you had Mia Farrow in some part throughout the 80s.
Well, they're
Uh,
smart women too, He writes
yes.
intellectual women and he plays with the dichotomies between men and women and the struggles with that. A lot of his films are about, the sexual frustrations and games between men and women, uh the things that women have to deal with that men don't have to deal with. I mean, Hannah and Her Sisters is about, three women and the men in their lives and how those relationships play out over years. Yeah, I that's the thing. You see something like Woody Allen and you're like, well, yeah, you could write great female roles in comedies. It's he did it like 30 times. But you see this, and this is a film that's like was called like groundbreaking, and it feels like what they thought was groundbreaking was that it was women doing this really crass, outdated toilet humor, like, oh, they're shitting and barfing and swearing. And because they're women doing it, that's what makes it so innovative. Even though if this was a group of guys doing this still, and I'm not saying I don't like movies that do stuff like this, like Hot Tub Time Machine has some humor like this, but I don't see the innovation of like oh, Melissa McCarthy shitting, or they're saying fuck, so this is a groundbreaking movie that, like, changes our perceptions of things, because it's not a well-executed version of that kind of humor, for one thing, and just the fact that they're women doing it doesn't give it some kind of special, like, extra level of quality or sophistication that makes it stand out. Like, I feel like if this was a group of guys and it was called Groomsmen and it was the same movie, I don't think people would be jumping on it as much. I think people would be like, "Yeah, this movie's very mediocre, to bad." But
Well,
I
there was a movie called it was called the Hangover,
yeah,
and Chris called this a Hangover for women, and fuck you. Hangover's a much better movie, even though that's another like basic movie. I actually had bought the Hangover, and it's pretty tight. It's a tightly constructed movie with a pretty good premise about these group of friends, these longtime friends, go out to Vegas and they party too much to the point where they can't remember what happened the night before, which is a genius concept. But I think the movie nowadays is it's kind of dated given how they overutilize their actors over the sequels and they kind of like worn out their welcome. But looking at it in isolation, it's a damn good movie.
well, Todd
It's a
Phillips
fun
is a
time.
better director. It's a better directed movie. Um, and the actors are better in the movie. Like, the characters come across better, and the pacing, and particularly the structure of the movie is superior. Because Bridesmaids is sort of structureless. It's almost like watching like a Eric Romer film or something, or like it's very strange that it just kind of like meanders through scenes without any kind of like, like I said, there's not like setup. Like, a lot of these jokes aren't things that are set up that like have payoffs later. A lot of the humor is like just extended set pieces that aren't necessarily like slapstick or screwball. It's trying to be like verbal comedy, but there's a lack of wit and punch to a lot of the dialogue. But you said you had some notes. Is there something you want to talk about with this movie that stood out to you, like something you want to cover right now?
Yeah, the long thing. Sorry, let me rephrase that. The thing I had in my mind for like the longest time is that the movie's called Bridesmaids, and outside of like the Kristen Wiig, Maya Rudolph, Rose Byrne, like triangle, and I guess you could throw in Melissa McCarthy in some places. Like none of the other bridesmaids aren't that prominent. Like Ellie Kemper and Wendy McGlynn and Covey from Reno 911. They don't really have much of a function in it. They're mainly just like background actors for the most part.
Yeah, it's funny you bring her up because I actually think she's like the most talented comedic actress out of the group too.
And she has like the best lines.
Yeah, that chick from Reno 911 and the Goldbergs is like really, really funny.
Hmm.
Um well, the thing is, like, I want to talk about a couple things I like, though. It's strange to me, and it's so weird. This is like when Girls came out, and like I hated it, but I liked the guy characters. Like, I liked Adam Driver on it. The cop character in this movie, that guy from the IT crowd, um,
Yeah,
he's the best part of
Chris
this.
O'Dowd.
Chris O'Dowd, he's the best part of this movie, like, by far.
Hmm.
And it's strange. It's
Yeah,
like,
because he's not relying on improvisation. The director is actually sticking to the script that Chris O'Dowd is given for his character, and yeah, he is one of the best parts of the movie. And that's another thing I kind of made notes about. Is just like the male characters, the male actors are so underutilized, except for Chris O'Dowd. Like Terry Crews has like one scene in the movie, and it's like a
Tim
fucking 1 minute scene.
Heidecker's like in this movie and does nothing.
Yeah, I know. Like, there's weird passing dialogue
Yeah.
between the relationship with him and Maya Rudolph by Melissa McCarthy, but you don't really see anything with Tim Heidecker. Sorry, I'm mispronouncing his
I
name.
think it's Tim
Tim
Heidecker.
Heidecker.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. Like, should we just go into the climax? Why it's so shit? Just to lead into my point.
Yeah, go ahead.
So
Keep going. Yeah.
okay, so like, okay, yeah, Kristen Wiig, she has a falling out with Maya Rudolph because the wedding that's being like handled by Rose Byrne doesn't really like it's it kind of causes a friction between their friendship, and so the exciting climax that we get out of this is Maya Rudolph goes missing. I believe on her wedding day for like 12 hours, and so even Kristen Wiig has a falling out with Chris O'Dowd's character, and she goes to him to see if they could help find Maya Rudolph, and it turns out she was having a bit of lady problems because they happened to find her in her fucking apartment. And excuse me, ugh. Tim Hendiker like doesn't really get a say in this. You don't really mention what he's feeling or what he's thinking about the situation. Like you never get his point of view, how he feels about Maya Rudolph, just leaving him at the altar. Like no one no male character has like a voice throughout this film, which I kind of find it pretty strange.
Yeah, it like masquerades as a progressive movie, but it's actually like making the mistake that a lot of male-driven comedies do, where the female characters are kind of background, and the male characters become background in this. Where, well, that's a weird thing because the things I like about the movie, and I haven't seen it in a long time, but memory is I like the scenes with the Chris O'Dowd character with Kristen Wiig, and I like he's like very charming, and I like the John Hamm stuff because I like it's almost like I prefer this movie if it was about her character kind of balancing between like she's having sex with this douchebag guy that treats her like crap, but then there's this really nice guy that because she's such a toxic person, she can't make this relationship work with him. And I think that's actually an interesting premise because the bridesmaids idea behind this, and even in the climax, it's like it doesn't build towards anything. Like I don't know what makes like why this is even about a character getting married and then being bridesmaids, except like because the idea essentially I think with the like Kristen Wiig's character is older, she's like in her mid-30s, she's not married, she's unhappy, her life's miserable, so this wedding and this celebration is making all of her insecurities and her life falling apart coming to the forefront. So if the movie like covered a weekend of a wedding and she was the bridesmaids and it spanned like 2 days,
Mhm.
and that was sort of the comedic premise of it, is that she meets this guy, the Chris O'Dowd character, and they start to form a relationship. But meanwhile, she's in this really abusive relationship with John Hamm. And then over the course of the weekend, she has to kind of learn to like come back around and be a happier, more complete person, and start of like self pitying herself. She sees that she can actually have something. It essentially should be a rom com hidden inside of this like almost four weddings and a funeral kind of comedy that's lighthearted, but it does have some crass humor and stuff like that. Because what this is really lacking that a lot of the other Judd Apatow films, produced films, and directed films have is that like sentimental aspect where there's emotion and character development happening. You could just tell I'm slurring from beer, but character development happening underneath the surface of these like improv extended sequences. But this movie, I don't think has that. I think it's
No.
sloppy.
Yeah, I mean, when you look at stuff like For Your Virgin, where Steve Carell going into this relationship with Catherine Keener's character, starting to let go of like what he has held attached to him for all these years, like all his action figures he has to sell, and Knocked Up, like Seth Rogen being like this very slacker dude who by all accounts isn't the right person for Catherine Heigl to have like a father figure around their child. But Seth Rogen learns to like just to man the fuck up and let go of his priorities that he has with his friends and start to use the skills that he had for that Mr. Skin website to go into web design and be able to afford an apartment for the both of them and learns how to read the baby books and funny people like it's tackling like the bitterness and the joy behind a comedian who uh, is going through like a terminal crisis going on with them, and and, despite his success, he's pretty lonesome and miserable and embittered. But he has this like newfound friendship that he never has with Seth Rogen's character, who is a rising comedian in that movie. There's a lot of good stuff in those movies. Even if people feel, especially with funny people, I think, I think the tide's kind of turned around where people don't really like that movie that much. But I do appreciate it for that angle that Apatow takes, especially since he started his whole career as a comedian. And he's networked with M. Seller to make that movie. So there's really none of that in Bridesmaids, and I think, yeah, because Chris O'Dowd's like Chris O'Dowd's like a sweet character to Kristen Wiig's life. Like, he lets her sleep over. He wakes up to make her coffee, and it's not like he's trying to pressure her to go back to baking. He's just like he's just trying to just kind of help her out, just trying to get that spark again in baking, but she feels very, like, insecure about it, so she just, like, drops the whole relationship and never, like, calls him back for anything, so yeah, it's just, like, Kristen Wiig's really unlikable in that whole movie, and she
Yeah,
just puts herself in a deeper and deeper rabbit hole.
yes, and you're supposed to and I respect that Kristen Wiig doesn't, like, just try to be a likable character, like, I respect that, like, her big breakout film comedically, she tried to present, like, a negative female and didn't lean into, being like, "Oh, we just love her in this movie," but I'm trying to avoid the comedy aspects because I don't find this movie funny. I'm just trying to
That's
talk.
part of it because she's so unlikable, and then she comes out making these very sticky jokes, that makes it worse.
Yeah, because the idea is, like, if she's supposed to be funny, like, it's Kristen Wiig performing and overacting and overdoing it, she's almost, like, trying to Jim Carrey in this. Then if she's gonna be kind of a bitch in the way that Jim Carrey could kinda play an asshole like Ace Ventura, you have to find the right balance. And I feel like she doesn't do it, like, she leans so much on that maybe her talent as a comedian, gets lost in that where you don't get like, her character isn't presented as funny, so when she does these funny things, to me in the movie, it always felt like it was just random when she does this stuff. It didn't feel like in character, it just seems like it comes out of nowhere because they need jokes.
Yeah. And, just in context of the movie, I mean, she's terrible at it. She's maintaining this lousy job at a jewelry store where she's constantly on the edge, annoying customers to the point she's, like, berating some fucking 15-year-old girl to the point where she does get fired for it.
Well, that's the thing, it's not like character-based humor, it's random humor because
Mhm.
this movie doesn't really have, like, characters. There's, like, 2 people that feel like characters, and then everyone else feels like it's the actor performing, which, Will Ferrell's but even, like, when you bring up a guy like a Will Ferrell, but so they always kinda do play into character. Like, Will Ferrell is Buddy the Elfin Elf. He is his character Frank in Old School, even though he is going for it, but they never lose sense of the character at the heart of it. I never feel like, who is Kristen Wiig's character? It's just Kristen Wiig, like, performing shtick for 2 hours. And once again, if it was, like, 90 minutes long, I think maybe you could go with it, but, like, I always found, like, especially, like, credit to you for watching this that many times, but, like, it's excruciating to sit through this movie with how long it
Yeah.
is.
Mhm.
I mean, the last, like I actually think in some ways it gets better as it goes on, but like the middle stretch I think is such a fucking drag, and I feel the way about all of Paul Feig's movies, like except Spy.
Yeah, I would give a lot to Spy because it wasn't so it's a tighter movie than his previous works, and then, than Ghostbusters, of course, but,
Well, if it's
you
weird
see,
because he
they
wrote
they
he
never
wrote Spy too, and I feel like that one he
mhm,
actually wrote a script and
yeah.
he actually kind of made a movie and he had a premise, and I feel like with these other ones he let the actors like Ghostbusters in this, and then, like, The Heat's This Way with Sandra Bullock, and he just, like, lets his actors, like, dominate the movie, and sometimes Adam McKay will do this. I felt that way about, like, the other guys, where it's like, you're just letting Mark Wahlberg and Will Ferrell, like, do whatever the fuck they want in this movie. And it can work. It can work when you just have, like, somebody who's really funny improvising, and you just, like, take the best stuff and you keep that, but I think the real question comes in here because 'cause I'm thinking about it. Kristen Wiig's never really been, like, funny or made a really funny movie. Anything I've ever liked her in really wasn't, like, a comedy.
Yeah, I was never like a fan of Kristen Wiig. I think she always played up the just the bitchy girl shtick in many of those Apatow movies. But I don't think she's not that attractive of an actress to carry on this role. Because here's a weird thing I have that really distracted me. I feel like Kristen Wiig never like washed her hair throughout that whole movie. I feel like she looks no different from when she got food poisoning in that scene.
Yeah, Kristen Wiig's, like, sexuality, I feel, has always been, like, a little bit overstated, like, it's something we don't talk about too much, but it feels like to me that there's always been this push that, like, she's, like, really hot, and I don't think she's, like, a bad-looking woman, but it does feel like she tries to lean in the way that Tina Fey sort of leaned into this as her career has gone on of, like, being attractive, or Sarah Silverman's whole career, but yeah, I don't think Kristen Wiig quite pulls off, like, the sexuality enough to make it work. Like, that opening scene with her and John Hamm where they're having sex, like, it should not only be, like, funny and absurd, but there should also be a little bit of, like, hotness to it. Aubrey Plaza does this a lot. Like, if you watch Safety Not Guaranteed, Aubrey Plaza is clearly leaning into, like, her sensuality and her, like, enchantress. That's, like, part of what makes her appealing. And I don't have an issue
Yeah.
with somebody doing that, by the way, but I don't think Kristen Wiig actually knows how to be sexy despite not, like, being bad looking, excluding maybe, like, in Wonder Woman 1984, the best film of last year.
Yeah. I think, going back to a character, like, yeah, she's not a likable presence throughout the whole movie, but at the same time, I will give it the benefit of the doubt that the movie tries to frame her as a problem to all these engagements that her and the bridesmaids have. That are just purely incidental or just caused by, other influences, like the food poisoning scene. I mean, I wouldn't really, like, fault that on Kristen Wiig just looking back at it because, it is said, like, before the whole food poisoning happens is that, she's taking Maya Rudolph to go to these very obscure restaurants that worked out well for them. But, it was just like they just happened to catch it because, of course, the food wasn't properly cooked, of course. And, so that's merely incidental, so I can't really fault that on her character, and, the flight to Vegas, even though the Rose Byrne character, who has a rivalry with, Kristen Wiig, gets the advantage over her of convincing the bridesmaids to take this trip to Vegas, so she's won the battle there, like, Rose Byrne just, like, won the girl's attention, but for some reason, she sabotages the whole flight by giving Kristen Wiig, like, pills because it's said that Kristen Wiig's character has, like, an issue about flying, she has a fear of flying, so, she is then given, like, scotch and some pills, and then she's, like, intoxicated to the point where she, completely sabotages the whole flight, gets herself arrested, and then that causes the friction, but it's mainly on Rose Byrne's character, like, not even Maya Rudolph questions, like, "What did you do to her to have her act this way?"
Well, I'm gonna say this, I think this movie would be a lot better if Rose Byrne was the lead character and not Kristen Wiig.
Oh, of
Uh,
course, she's the better looking one,
yeah, and she's a
and she's
better
a lot more funnier.
she is funnier than Kristen Wiig as a performer. Yeah, I remember Max Landis talking about this once where he was praising this about her problems, and then, like, he hated Trainwreck, and he was, like, shitting on Trainwreck and praising Bridesmaids, and I'm just like, I've heard people talk about this movie and praise the fact that, like, yeah, it's great that she has all these flaws, that she has to get her life together, that's what makes it compelling, and I can hear that argument, but it's like, it almost makes it like a cynical, depressing experience, like, it's not like, I'm not rooting for her to come out at the end, and if she does, I'm not happy for her. You know what I mean?
Yeah,
Like,
I feel
I don't
like
feel good at the end for her character where it's like those other movies, 40-Year-Old Virgin, Knocked Up, you're, like, happy when things
yeah,
work out for the characters. You like, I'm rooting against her in this, like, I would prefer this movie if everyone just told her, like, "Hey, fuck off." Because I feel like it just because it goes so absurd and it's so poorly made. And maybe this had a better director and better editing once again. Like, it's almost hard to fault her because, like, like, if I was editing this movie, I would just cut a lot of this stuff out that presents it this way. and maybe she didn't know that when they were making it that he's gonna keep all this stuff. Because she's probably just trying to do as many jokes, and it's like, okay, well, they'll probably cut it down. I mean, if this is the cut down version, I can't imagine what the original cut of this movie was. Was it like 4 hours? Was it like Heaven's Gate?
I recall Cinemax aired like the unrated version, and I don't remember much out of it other than that it was fucking unnecessary to have an unrated version.
Yeah, that was this weird gimmick, like, over the last like, they don't do it as much anymore, where they would do an unrated version, and then it was just like they would just add, like, 2 extra scenes,
Hmm.
and it was like, "Why is this unrated? It's, like, the same fucking movie." And they would
Oh,
advertise, "Get the unrated version. There might be some titties."
well, even though Ghostbusters didn't have titties, that didn't really work out for that favor, and people consider that
Now,
extended version to be the best
Madcap,
version
that's
of.
where you're wrong. There's that hilarious scene where Chris Hemsworth draws boobs.
Oh, I mean, that was in the theatrical version.
Yeah, so there are some ghost titties. Um,
Oh,
s
oh, shit, mind blown.
so what God, we're talking about this movie, it's so hard, like, it's making me angry and depressed talking about it, like, I feel like the Kristen Wiig character. Like, it's fun to show because a lot of enthusiasm when talking about something or fun is talking about, like, "Hey, even if I don't like this movie, we can talk about it in this way," but, like, a lot of what I think contributed to the death of movies or modern aesthetics is, like, how every movie has this flat look now, or this certain editing rhythm that comes from, like, J.J. Abrams or Michael Bay, but I also feel like this movies like this contributed to, like, the death of, like, comedies or certain types of movies that used to get made because it's so lazy
I 100% agree. Yeah.
that looking back on this movie was actually super detrimental and contributes to where we are now, where it's like comedy doesn't even exist anymore because we accepted something like this and this was praised, and then the entire standards were changed. It's like, well, you don't need to write jokes. You can just get actors who like. It almost feels like Apatow in retrospect was like a really bad thing because the reason that Seth Rogen stands out today and still has over the years is because he's not just all improv. Seth Rogen is a writer and always approaches his stuff from that point of view. Even the stuff of his that doesn't work, he clearly puts a lot of work into like structure and tone, and Evan Goldberg and him really work on that. And I feel like I'm getting angry thinking about this because it was like it's just that thing with film critics again, where like so many movies come out that would be funny, or this happens with horror films, and then like these Paul Feig movies, critics were just like, these are great. Even Ghostbusters
Yeah.
got
Big
mostly
time.
positive reviews. And like this one's like an even worse example of like they acted like this was this great comedy and audiences responded to it, and it all just feels like it's hard to look back on and not just see this as like this was just like a really bad thing for like culture. It was about because I don't think like people are looking back on this, even if people are talking about looking back on it 10 years later, like, wow, man, Bridesmaids, that was the one, and it just put
Mm.
like a stink on that whole era of comedy and what they were doing. Where I think about the decade before that, before Judd Apatow took over, and it was like the Will Ferrell and the Ben Stiller movies and Owen Wilson and all that stuff were like Wedding Crashers, or I feel like there was just a lot more craftsmanship in those movies than there were with this era. You know,
There's like a lot more spontaneity with the actors they got, like Obos and Vince Vaughn, Will Ferrell and John Heater and Blaze of Glory. They're just like there was like an abundance of comedies in that decade.
and most of
Anchorman,
them
of
are like
course.
very watchable. Like
Yeah.
it was a crazy decade where every year there was like 4 or 5 comedies came out and they were almost all funny. Like, yeah, like Blades of
Mhm.
Glory was funny, and like, yeah, the Anchorman, and then like, yeah, Step Brothers, which as time has gone on, I think has aged really well. And then like The Office was on TV, and then Parks and Rec came out a few years later, and it's like, wow, this was like a great era for comedy, and I just so let's say what's more detrimental. I mean, I know my answer, but what do you think's more egregious, the Melissa McCarthy nomination or the best screenplay nomination?
You got me at a cross.
I
I
think
would
it's
say, yeah, it was
screenplay.
definitely Melissa McCarthy,
I'm gonna
especially
go
since
I'm gonna
Oh,
go.
sorry. Go
I'm
ahead.
sorry. I'm gonna go with screenplay just because, like, I think it's embarrassing this got nominated for best original screenplay. The only credit I give to them nominating Melissa McCarthy is just like, okay, at least they nominated a comedic performance in a movie. Where this screenplay is like fucking awful. And all the great comedy screenplays that were written that weren't nominated. Outside of like Woody Allen films, but like Melissa McCarthy, it's like, well, I don't think she deserved a nomination, but it's like that's the thing that also stings about this too, though. Like, what the fuck, like,
Wasn't Marion wasn't Marion Cotillard, like, she came out a supporting actress role in Midnight in Paris. Why wasn't she nominated?
well, if like you're gonna nominate Melissa McCarthy in this, then like, yeah, why wasn't like, yeah, why didn't Zach Galifianakis get nominated for The Hangover? If that's the standard, or like, why didn't Will Ferrell get nominated for Elf, or why didn't Jim Carrey win an Oscar for Mask? I mean, it's just kind of like, wait a minute, this was the one. This was the one that was good enough. All right, do you have any more notes? Do you have anything else you have written down that you want to talk about? Because I'm trying to. The problem is I haven't seen this for years. You've recently watched it, so I remember most of the scenes. I remember hating it, the tone, the pacing. Definitely hated the jokes. I think I only laughed like a handful of times. I remember. Let's talk about that. Is there anything you found funny? I remember laughing at the scene where Kristen Wiig just has like the breakdown where she's like, "You got to be like fucking kidding me," and she starts like destroying everything.
Mhm.
I remember thinking that was funny. I don't know if that's still good now, but when I first saw the movie years ago, I remember thinking that was like pretty well done because it doesn't go on for 10 minutes. And it's like, I don't know. I think she's good in that part. And it's just kind of insane. And that and the Crystal Dallas scenes, but I can't remember a lot of stuff that stands out that I thought was funny. Maybe there's like one liners I forgot or something like that. You've watched it recently. So what is funny in Bridesmaids?
Well, despite the fact that we kind of bitched about the one-upping each other in that bridal shower speech, there's one moment where I did kind of like still laugh at. It's where like Melissa McCarthy, oh no, Melissa McCarthy, excuse me, Kristen Wiig takes the mic back. She just like randomly stares at Maya Rudolph and her fiance, and then they before she breaks into song. I guess that's funny. Um,
Is there like a standout funny scene? Is there like what's like the highlight of the movie comedically? Because I haven't seen it in long. Like, is there a part that actually is like well done and funny?
oh, that's funny because oh no pun intended. Uh, all the big scenes are trying to play out that way, but I don't really find them all that hilarious, which is it's kind of hard for me to pick out which stands out like the most. John Hamm plays a good chauvinistic douchebag. Like, he's like doesn't really have much screen time in the movie. Terry Crews is fun, but again, like that's the other thing with when you listen out those other comedies that Feig later worked on, like Spy, like he let Jason Statham like have as much fun as he possibly can get out of him, and I think that was a good decision having Statham like take over for most of Spy opposite of Melissa McCarthy, letting the male actor get his way in one of his comedies for once.
Well, we talked about it like a few days ago. There's that scene in Spy where like the guy dies and falls over, and then she pukes afterwards on top of him. And
Yeah,
like,
because big difference is like the food poisoning scene, like clearly could have been just cut the fuck down. But with the puking scene, Spy, it's a nice little like, because like yeah, body humor, like toilet humor, it's bound to make anybody laugh. And usually, I think in part with modern comedy, it's a lazy sort of trope, but it's a good like little subversive like comedic beat where yeah, like the guy that Melissa McCarthy fights like falls on rebar off a balcony, and you're focusing on the dead guy, but then Melissa McCarthy just pukes out of nowhere, and then it, like you don't really catch it happening ahead of time. So that's the big difference, and it's very brief, so it doesn't really linger on it, and it just moves on. It doesn't really like overstay its welcome.
yeah, it's a gag instead of like a sequence. Because, like, if you did
Mhm.
something where, like, let's say Melissa McCarthy's character got food poisoning, and then she went and did the shit scene, and then some girl opened the door, and she, like, did that thing where there's that scene where she, like, looks at her at the face, and she's like, "Don't look at me," or something like this. I can't remember what she says. But, like, if that was the only joke, like, somebody opened the door and she was in there and she was laying on top of a sink, then it's like, okay, it's a one-off joke. And I think it would be
Mhm.
funnier because, like, it would almost come as a surprise, like, "Oh, shit." But, like, it's like a I mean, I haven't seen some, but I remember these scenes all feeling like they were, like, 10 minutes. I
Did you
remember
get the
being,
feeling
like,
like they were like
crazy, like, they all went on forever.
yeah. Did you ever get the feeling like there were like 2 different takes of those scenes?
Yes.
Or like they just added like another scene within the scene? Because here's a weird thing in the flight to Vegas where Kristen Wiig gets intoxicated for most of that scene. There's one little moment where after she just like knocks out from her from being drunk, she wakes the fuck up and she just like fucking randomly panics out of nowhere and like causes the whole flight to they it causes like the entire flight attendants and even that fucking air marshal played by who I like to call Melissa McCarthy's dumb shit husband like arrest her and it feels like a different scene because I'm not I don't drink at all so I'm not really like
No,
well
I get what you're
experienced in
saying, though. It feels like a
alcohol.
scene is over, and then it keeps going and turns into another scene instead of, like, that's the end of the scene and we go to the next scene. Like, like, it switches in movie to another scene and keeps extending the sequence before it to where you, like, get, like, tired.
Yeah.
That's, like, the
Hmm.
issue. So do you like, you said you had some notes. Is there something we haven't discussed yet? Because I don't really have too much left to say, so I'm gonna see if you have something that we can talk about. Because I'd like I'm like, okay, we kind of covered like unless there's something we missing. Because once again, you've watched this recently, so is there like some element of this film that we haven't really, Because the thing about revisiting this is, I think the thing that I would take away from this more than anything is just that this is this is just an example of like a one of this like classic, really, really like the critics got it wrong. It makes you question the whole like idea of what critics' jobs are. The fact that this made so much fucking money, and
And
looking
it led to a pattern of where comedies really took a downturn because,
I
you know,
agree.
with word of mouth and money, Hollywood just wanted to like follow its footsteps, and I think that led to a very bad place with comedies, especially other movies besides Trainwreck and shows like Girls. Like I'm not sure if you've seen the movie Sisters with Tina Fey and Amy Poehler,
Yeah.
and that was just like another product of like 2 hours of improv, which I found to be pretty unwatchable.
So what are we missing is let's wrap this up with a few questions. What does it say
Go ahead.
about female-driven comedies where they're improvising as opposed to the male-driven version? Like, is it us that we find Seth Rogen and Paul Rudd saying, I know why you're gay funny, but we don't find the women in these movies doing it funny? Is it like because we're men and we don't get it? Like, what does it say about us? And it's like the big question I have is comedy dead? Because I've really been dealing with that the last couple of years where I feel like it is, at least in this like mainstream form. Cuz like what's a big mainstream comedy that came out in the last few years, or like even a TV show that's on right now that's like, that's not like an animated show or something, or like, is there a what's the Seinfeld or Frasier, or like what's the, there's something about Mary of today, because I think a lot of this kind of humor is like stuff that like the Fairley Brothers popularized in the 90s. Like, and there's something about Mary, she has like cum in her hair,
Mhm.
and that's not far off from the kind of jokes that are in Bridesmaids. But once again, there's a setup to that joke, right? Like, Chris Elliott tells Ben Stiller, like, "You've never jerked off before you go on a date, you know? You gotta get, like." He was like, "The moment that a man is the most honest with himself is after he ejaculates, because then he starts thinking of, like, a chick because he's not trying to get laid." So he tries to convince Ben Stiller of this, and then Ben Stiller's jerking off before his date with Mary. So we actually have a lot of setup to that, and it's insane. Like how he's jerking off and everything is crazy. And then he doesn't know where his cum went, and then she walks in and it's like she's like, "What's with your ear?" And he's like, "Oh, it's hair gel." And she's like, "Great, I need some." And then you see her put her fingers through the hair, and then when they cut to the restaurant, you see how her hair looks with the cum in it. So there's like a lot of setup, and then the payoff is to see that visual with her hair like that. You know what I mean?
Y-
Like
Yeah.
that's the way to do that sort of thing. Like there's actually a lot of sophistication to that, even though it's like very crass and like, or he zips his penis, up into his pants. But that scene goes on a while, but it's funny because he's gonna go on the date with this girl, it's his dream girl. He goes to the bathroom, he accidentally does it, then the parents come in, then a fireman shows up and goes, "Hey, I heard a scream down the road," and then someone else shows up. I feel like that's like the good way of doing this sort of thing. It's like we devolved from like Fairley Brothers to like Todd Phillips, and then it ended with like Judd Apatow, then Paul Feig. Is the pattern I see here, where this is like the lazy version of this. Because say what you want about the Fairley Brothers or Todd Phillips and Judd Apatow, particularly Fairley Brothers, but I think there's like good filmmaking involved with that. Outside of like we're gonna do really gross jokes, or we're really gonna go as far as we possibly can to get a laugh. We're gonna do whatever we can to get a laugh, like the desperate attempt for a laugh, but really crafting it as opposed to this where they are desperately trying to get laughs, which I understand, but then they don't like one, I don't think they find the laughs in this movie is a big issue with it. But secondly, I think maybe if the laughs are in there, Paul Feig in particular didn't know how to create the sort of momentum or rhythm that lets the laughs play out, where it's like, I'm watching that when I watched this, all I thought was like, this is like amateurish. Is
Mhm.
how I feel with this movie. I don't think it's this professional, well done movie that like should be celebrated and successful. When I watch it, I'm like, this should be like, I think this should have like 23% on Rotten Tomatoes and should have been a bomb. Like I'm sure. Like I look back, I'm like, wait, people didn't hate this movie. This wasn't seen as like a disaster. And it makes me think where people's sensibilities are, where it's like, because everyone says they like comedy, and everyone thinks they have a good comedic sensibility, and everyone thinks that like they have a sense of humor, and everyone thinks that like, and they was lean subjective. But I think a lot of times people do that, and then they don't actually want to validate the fact that they really don't understand it. And I think you see this with horror a lot too, where for like decades critics just shit on these great horror movies. And then now these horror movies that come out that are like super critically acclaimed, you watch them and you're like, what the fuck? This is supposed to be a masterpiece? And I feel like it's like everybody embracing genre to a certain degree, but then them not really.
Yeah, it's like an inverse effect where they're just praising it for what's on the surface rather than looking at the film deeper than what it appears to be. Because yeah, that's all the victim of just like shameless virtue signaling that's really caught on since Bridesmaids, and it's really affected movies, and how we look at movies where we don't really have much credibility to trusting critics or any reliance on how these critics would like recommend or give appraisal to a movie that ultimately doesn't really deserve that much appraisal.
That's what I take away from this more than anything. I think that's where the interesting discussion came in, is that when we talked about Chronicle, we're like, oh, why isn't there more of this? There's like Unbreakable, but like, wow, we live in this Marvel world, but like, wow, this movie was actually really like innovative and interesting, and it still holds up in that way. There's still a
Mhm.
novelty to Chronicle all these
Yeah.
years later. Where Bridesmaids, you look back and you just think it's like almost embarrassing as a culture that we like accepted this. And I don't feel like Ghostbusters, like when that happened and that disaster happened, I feel like it was always there. It just took a few movies for everyone to catch up to it. You know what I mean? Like that these people really weren't that talented or funny and great at improvising, or that Paul Feig wasn't that good. I feel like he got away with it for a while. And then I feel like Ghostbusters exposed it to where it's like, oh, you can't defend this even though people try to. But it was always there. Like it's like Ghostbusters isn't that much worse than than Heat or this movie.
Yeah, it's just
It's
like
the
when you
same
pull the
thing.
curtain. Yeah, it's like when you pull the curtain from the Wizard of Oz and you find out that there's no wizard really. There's no genius behind it. I think that's kind of led to the point that we're at in terms of giving our own critical sensibility towards movies. Because I think with like Mahler and Southpaw, when they see like these modern movies that are
Mm.
pretty terrible, we kind of like look back to the roots, whether if the movies that follow that line leading up to those Marvel movies, like franchises, what have you, like Toy Story or Spider Man. They kind of like look back to see if they're if like the older films hold any weight today, and clearly some of them don't. But it's the same way I could approach with this movie because Ghostbusters was this huge monumental disaster in Feast's career. You kind of want to look back to see like was Bridesmaids like a true winner? Was this all a fluke? And I'm of the opinion that it's all a fluke.
I agree. I think it was a fluke too. I think it probably came out at the right time. I think Melissa McCarthy was like going to blow up. I think that people really wanted a movie like this with women in it. I think that the Apatow brand still had something to it. I still think we were kind of living in like a post Hangover world. And people were really into the R-rated comedy. I think they marketed this movie very well. I think they sold it very well. I think Bridesmaids is like a very good appealing title. I think the poster was very appealing. Like you see the poster and you look at the title and you're like, okay, I kind of want to see that movie. What's going on here? You know what I mean? Like there's something to it,
And you
but
get half the Bridesmaids.
yeah. And then there was the thing where like Spy came out and I thought, well, okay, well this is actually okay. So maybe like yeah, I hated Bridesmaids and I thought it was overrated, but that's happened to me with a lot of comedies and I'm like, okay, but then by the time that like we get to Ghostbusters, it's like, oh, okay, yeah, this was a fluke. And I feel like that was this is like, I know we always, it's almost like passe and ridiculous to like talk about the culture war or like what's been going on or even what like Mahler talks about, or like really pointing out how bad a lot of modern day movies are. And then like they get a pass somehow for like, for just like terrible writing and so on. But I this does feel like this was very culturally significant as a movie, as I feel like this was one of the early parts where critics really started to divide from, like, the online fan base. Because I feel like I remember a lot of people shitting on this movie that were, like, online critics as opposed to the mainstream critics, and I always kind of felt like there was this feeling that like, even on IMDb, this has, like, a 6.7 or something, you know? So I always feel like there was this people just accept. I feel like this was always tied to politics. I feel like the people who probably like this movie, my assumption is that they're, like, liberal and they view through a filter of, like, liberalism and, like, this is good because of these merits that I think are what makes up the quality. If you, like, notice the last 3 years, all these, like, black filmmakers making all these black films, and they're like Barry Jenkins or,
Spike Lee.
yeah, and, like yeah, exact Spike, but just, like, all of a sudden, we're like Black Klansman, there's an Underground Railroad show on now. There Judah and the Black Messiah, Moonlight. I mean, the whole Academy Awards, Ma Rainey's Black Bottom, and I'm not saying it's a bad thing, but it feels like it's in vogue right now to, like, if you're a black filmmaker and you're making a black film about police brutality, slavery, discrimination. You're making a love story with two black people. Steve McQueen recently did a mini series of like critically acclaimed stories of black actors. It feels like it's in trend right now, and everybody's like praising this stuff and being like, oh, and all this stuff, and they're really trying to push it and be like, this is what's great right now, even though like this stuff isn't as great as they're trying to present it. Because whenever something becomes like cool or trendy to them, that's what people cling on to. So it's like what happened with the LGBT community. It used to like represent individualism and it was a counterculture. Now people propagate it and use it for their own like gain, or they do queer baiting. And they're like,
Mhm.
oh, well, if you just make an LGBT film or you're a gay filmmaker, that alone is like significant enough to give something a positive review. And it feels like we don't live in this feminism third wave in particular movement anymore, but I feel like at this time this movie was really benefiting from like this was right on the cusp of that like explosion of third wave feminism and that culture change. So people were like, well, it's women doing something that men have done, so thus it is important and we have to make a statement with this. We have to like use this as an example. So we have to give Academy Award nominations to this movie. People have to go see this movie because it's important in that way. And it's funny, I think back to where my channel started, and a lot of my channel started as a response to these things years ago with stuff like Ghostbusters, where it was just it became instead of quality merits of film or not, it became a political argument and a cultural argument about where we were as a society that, well, you can't talk negatively about these things because they're important for these movements. And then we're seeing it still now. Now it seems to have really moved on to race is the big thing we're dealing with right now. It was like gay and female. Now it's like race is the number one thing in the headline because of what's been going on with police brutality in the country. And what I don't like about that is that it's not like the artists are reflecting what's going on, which I think is important for the artist to do. But it's so like pretentious now in the way it's done, and it's so cynical that I don't feel like there's a sincerity in these things. It's just done to be like, we have to praise these things and we have to propagate them. Hollywood does, even though they're not financially successful, even though generally people don't like it. We think it's important because we have to say that we're on the right side of something. And I feel like Bridesmaids is part of the early looking back that really was one of the first examples of that happening.
Mhm.
So it's an important film in that way. Instead of like this was significant in a positive way, I look at it, is it significant at least that this is the first sign, pre even the Star Wars sequels, we have to think about that, this predates that, of that political cultural divide seeping into our pulp culture
Yeah.
with the internet versus, Hollywood. And now I think if this movie came out, there would be way more negative. Like, I think Mahler would be doing a 3 hour, like a live stream about it, talking. I feel like this happened early enough, though it didn't get into that place where Ghostbusters came out right when that stuff was written. You know what I mean? Like, Ghostbusters suffered from it more because of when it came out. But if Bridesmaids had come out like 5 years later, I think it would have been a way bigger like argument because really people didn't argue about this much when it came out. And now it's like nobody cares about it anymore.
What are you talking about, man? Women are funny. Get over it.
Yeah. Yeah, that became Ghostbusters, but really that argument should have started happening with this movie.
I know. Yeah.
Because this is
It
the
is weird, like,
terrible
out of all
movie.
things
Yeah.
yeah, of all things, they use Ghostbusters as that vehicle. I think Ghostbusters was, like, the first that was, like, the most prominent thing to kick off the culture war
Yeah.
that we have in media nowadays.
Yeah, and now it's like obviously like, Star Wars is like the poster child for that, but we even see it with like WandaVision, Falcon and the Winter Soldier,
Yeah, Marvel's heavily leaning into that shit big time, and I
yeah,
think
to
already
their
saw that from Captain
detriment.
Marvel. Yeah, to their detriment, of course.
But I think us talking this, I didn't even realize it because I was going to this conversation like, what do I say about Bridesmaids revisiting it? But I think the significant thing I've taken away is that as we've gone through, it's really making me think about that. Like, wow, I never really looked at this movie that way, but I really feel like that's the thing about it is this was like, because that was the question at the beginning, right? Why was this so successful? And why did this claim? And I think that's really the answer is that it was like the early seepings of that culture war and of a political statement. And maybe Kristen Wiig and Paul Feig did not see it as that way. Maybe it wasn't opportunistic because I think Lena Dunham was much more overt about it, and that's why girls immediately started to get sort of a backlash after its first
Mhm.
season. Where I feel like this one they got away with it, and they benefited from it. And I don't know if it was intentional or not. I think Lena Dunham was trying to benefit from that sort of thing. I think they kind of just got lucky here that it came out at the right time.
Well, considering most of the actresses were already, like, above SNL, so I feel like that kind of factors in how lucky the success for Bridesmaids, came out as, when it first released, man.
Do you have any final thoughts about I like the SNL connection there, I think that's a very valid point too. There is almost sort of like a
Yeah.
Lorne Michaels stink over this thing. Um,
Mhm.
do you have any final thoughts about it? Do you have any final thing you wanna talk about that since you watched it? What was what's your takeaway of this besides, like, the cultural stuff like that? Do you have, like, something to say about Bridesmaids, since we're talking especially revisiting it, like, this coming out when did this come out? Like, 2011, 2012, something like that?
10 years, dude, a full decade.
Yeah, where do you think it stands now? Do you think, like, do is this still seen as, like, a really popular, important movie? Like, are people watching Bridesmaids?
I don't think so. I don't think nobody on Twitter, based on what I've read, had like they don't even like tag this movie. Don't even talk about it. So it's hard for me to say, but I kind of look at this movie and similarly to like stuff like Meet the Parents, or it's like it's a comedy, but you're kind of like embarrassed or just uncomfortable watching. Like with Meet the Parents, it's all about like Ben Stiller trying to get a blessing from Robert De Niro, but Robert De Niro's character like grills him constantly. So to the point where Ben Stiller does nothing wrong. He's like a charming dude, but at the same time, you're just pissed watching the movie.
I think
Um,
that's such an apt comparison. I was thinking of Meet the Parents too, where you're just
oh,
pissed off the whole time because it's just these, like, situations that happen to make you, like, pissed because people don't act like normal people.
mhm.
They just, like, act like assholes for no reason, and people
Yeah,
don't realistically react to it and being like, "Why are you acting this way?" Like, everyone in Meet the Parents is just an asshole to Ben Stiller for no reason.
yeah. Fucking Ben Stiller's like fiance doesn't even like she doesn't even notice it. It's that's why I find it fucking frustrating to watch that movie. And God forbid, like any successful comedy that's pretty mediocre gets fucking sequels that kind of like built the shit out of it. But you're essentially doing the same shit that I fucking hate, except worse.
Well, I guess the blessing we can see is that we never got Bridesmaids 2.
Yeah, that is true.
That is true. Well, Matt
Um,
sorry, yeah, you
one
got
other
anything?
yeah, one other thing I could say. Yeah, because Kristen Wiig's character never gets like a bounce back from her shitty life. She makes a couple cakes for Crystal Dowd, and she starts to warm up to her mom. But like, I come from a single parented household. I think this movie is kind of insulting to struggling women out there.
That's a
I
great
don't really,
point.
I don't really recommend. Yeah, because that's another like, that's a weird thing. Why the feminism shit like bits it in the ass like big time. It's just like, they want to make this representation towards certain women out there, but given like the writing for Kristen Wiig's character and her actions throughout the movie, like it's not a good like sort of like she's not a good role model to that sort of audience, and I find it pretty frustrating that you know coming from that sort of background where I was raised under a single mom when I was late in high school, and she was into comedies, and she finds this to be a pretty good movie, but it's pretty insulting to that to that aspect.
I think that's a really valid point. Well, hey, man, thanks for revisiting Bridesmaids with me.
Yeah, last thing I could say, Bridesmaids can lick Superbad's asshole where modern Melissa McCarthy swam from.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree. So the next time we do this, I'm thinking we dive into the opposite, where a movie that's aged like remarkably well. I'm thinking we talk about some Social Network. Um,
Mhm. I'm
yeah,
definitely looking forward to some Social Network.
yeah, because I've rewatched that movie like easily like a dozen times since it came out. And I think it's better now than when it came out, to be honest. So I'd like to talk. I
Oh,
actually enjoy the movie
yeah.
now more than I did when it came out.
Well, that's the one thing that the critics got right. That movie still holds up pretty tremendously well, and it's pretty relevant to the age that we live in now.
Yeah. Right. Yeah. I feel like when you say people, I feel like this movie has become culturally irrelevant.
Mhm.
But yeah, man, thanks for talking about this with me. It was really interesting.
Yeah, we kinda went all over the place, and I didn't really have my notes fleshed out well, but yeah, you pretty much just nailed, like, everything. Like, yeah, it's a bad comedy, poorly edited, and I wish, like, more work could have been done. Oh, one other thing I could close this off, you woulda think, would you say that the Kristen Wiig character would have benefited if she was recasted? with someone else that had more likability than Kristen Wiig? Because I was in my mind, I was thinking Rashida Jones would have played that character.
I feel like just in general, Hollywood, like, we let Rashida Jones down.
Yeah.
Like, where she just did a bunch of thankless roles in movies, and then, like, in TV, she gives a lot like, she's always given thankless roles, like, on The Office and Parks and Rec, and she's like in I Love You, Man as a wife. It's like, Rashida Jones is actually great and, like,
Yeah.
incredibly sexy and appealing,
Mhm.
and I agree that, like, I'm upset there wasn't more comedies built around Rashida Jones. It's a valid point, man, where I feel like society's kinda come around now where, like, Aubrey Plaza's big now, and I was like, "Okay," but I feel like we've let Rashida Jones down. I think that's a pretty damn good choice. Yeah, I'm thinking of stuff like the airplane scene and all that. I really think she would've, like, pulled that off.
Yeah, well, they have to keep the SNL network close, I suppose. But yeah, Hollywood, you took her for granted, man.
You did, but she'll always be in our hearts. Alright,
Mhm.
guys, thanks for watching or listening or whatever the fuck. Don't rewatch Bridesmaids, and if you've never seen it, don't pop it in. And credit to Madcap for bringing this up. I appreciate him for doing the heavy lifting and actually rewatching this movie. It's on Peacock if you want to check it out. And tell me what you think in the comments. I don't know. We covered a lot of things here. We were kind of all over the place, but the movie's kind of all over the place.
I say don't check it out. I would just say,
Yeah.
"Oh, well, this happened this week, Charles Grodin passed away, sadly. Go watch fucking Beethoven or Beethoven 2nd."
Yeah, go watch Midnight Run. Go watch Beethoven. Yeah. That's amazing.